about material property, as Maike, my predecessor here, has mentioned. Knowledge can be copied, can be distributed at no cost, or at least can at least be copied at no cost, and in any quantity you want. So if we start calling knowledge property, what we do, or those people who call knowledge property, what they really do is they appeal to the respect for material property that is much more deeply rooted in our societies. The respect for private property, which refers to material property. A good example here is the US Constitution. We all know that the United States probably have, well, are among the countries that have the most regard for private property in the world. But then the people who wrote the Constitution there, they said, no, you shouldn't have property on ideas, really. All you should get is, we have to find a compromise here. We have to get our citizens to create as much as possible so that our society will advance. But then we have to make this knowledge accessible to everyone. And we have to find a compromise between these two, between the creators' wish to profit and society's need to access knowledge. So what they said is we'll do this for a limited time. And that is the exact difference from material property. Because your right to your computer or your right to own your, I don't know what, your mattress, whatever, does not run out after a certain time. So this property term hides this possibility of lossless sharing and evokes fears of something being taken away from you if you share an idea, if someone uses your idea. Then the term intellectual property is really imprecise. It mixes together very different areas of law. People saying intellectual property often mean copyright, patents, trademarks, denominations of origin, industrial design. All this could be called intellectual property, but all these are areas of law that function very differently. And should be treated differently. I've seen many discussions between qualified people go to waste because some people insisted on using the term intellectual property, and then no one was sure if they were talking about copyrights or patents or chip designs, you know? Besides, as I've mentioned, the term ignores that copyrights and patents are just tools to achieve greater creativity in society. They're there to give an incentive. But in my opinion, they're being mishandled right now. They're being handled or changed too much in the favor of the rights holders, and the aspect that they're really there to benefit the public has been almost forgotten. So what is intellectual property then? Let's say it like it is. It's monopoly privileges. A copyright is a monopoly privilege given for a certain time. A patent is a monopoly privilege. That's important to remember. So where do we want to go? FSF Europe is among a group of organizations working for a treaty on access to knowledge. This treaty would, if all goes well, be an international treaty at the United Nations level, much like the TRIPS treaty I'll mention in a second, to put the public first, to get patents and copyrights back to their original function of fostering creativity instead of just being a tool for profit. There's nothing wrong with profit, don't get me wrong, but society has to come first. So this treaty would create a legal base to protect cultural freedom. It would be a sort of TRIPS in reverse. Who of you has heard of TRIPS treaty? Who of you has actually read a bit of it? All right. Then I'll just say a few words on that. The TRIPS stands for Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. It's a treaty signed in roughly 1995 by the members of the World Trade Organization. And it sets minimum standards for monopoly protection. It says, for example, all the countries that have signed this treaty have to have copyright durations of 50 years minimum. They can go above it if they choose. It says, for example, all the countries that have signed this treaty have to have patent protection of 20 years. All the countries signing this treaty have to provide for legislation to enforce these monopoly privileges. And this slide is supposed to be a very, very short comparison of the TRIPS treaty and the proposed Access to Knowledge treaty. While TRIPS sets minimum standards for monopoly protection, the Access to Knowledge treaty would set minimum standards for access to knowledge. And so the TRIPS treaty, in setting minimum standards, says you can always go above it. You can extend the duration of copyright. You can restrict even further what normal people with not-for-profit motives can do with copyrighted material. The Access to Knowledge treaty, which on the other hand say you must provide a minimum of access. And if you choose to, as a country, if you think it's beneficial to your society, you can go and give more access and give less protection to the monopolies. The durations are just one example, but they're the most clear. That's why I'm using it here. Very important also, the TRIPS treaty puts down all the required mechanisms for monopoly protection. It says you have to have this kind of institution, you have to have this kind of law that allows rights holders to enforce their monopoly privileges. While the Access to Knowledge treaty enumerates the required freedoms, it says you have to allow your people to do this and that and that and that with the material. But if you manage to give all these permissions and still tighten monopoly protection, then fine. But you have to give these permissions. That's the end of part one. I'll just to summarize. I hope to have made the point that access to knowledge is essential for culture and development, because knowledge is really what integrates us into a culture. Then that the term intellectual property is really a mistake. It really refers only to monopoly privileges on ideas. And this is why we need why we need a treaty on access to knowledge to protect our cultural freedom from restrictions like those of the TRIPS treaty and from restrictions that are much stricter, the so-called TRIPS plus treaties, which are coming right now. Because the rights holders, above all companies like Time Warner, Sony, BMG Universal, etc., say, well, we need more protection to be able to, pay our bands more, which really means pay our managers more. And that is why we need treaties that have the TRIPS protection plus something. So it's the TRIPS plus treaties. Okay, any questions so far? Yes?
About intellectual property, I see the problem that someone who's really making investments into research, or someone who wants to make art, needs financial freedom and has to get that back in some way.
Absolutely, I agree. And the Access to Knowledge Treaty and our work is not about taking away the financial incentive to develop ideas. And it's not about crashing the copyright system and replacing it with universal communism. But it's about rebalancing copyright. It's about, and the balance of what copyright is used for, especially copyright and patents, has shifted, in our view, too far in the rights holders' favor, because they have the lobbies. They have the money, which means usually the money to pay the dinners with the lawmakers, which is how lobbying works, okay? So we're just trying to shift it back in the public interest. All right, then on to the second part. How can access to knowledge be promoted? For example, by individuals or by NGOs. There's different possibilities. You can talk to rights holders. You can go to them and say, look, there's this new thing. It's called, for example, Creative Commons. And it's really cool. And you could, if you adjust your business model in the right way, you stand to profit a lot from this. So, and we could explain them how. And some of them might actually pick up on it. It's much more obvious in the software range, where there are indeed many small, medium-sized companies that do, for example, GNU Linux support. You can talk to lawmakers, the people who make the framework for the economy and the framework for the culture, and ask them to please take account of the public interest, and not only of the interest of big rights-holding companies. And you can go where the initial push on the lawmakers comes from, which is usually the United Nations. And in the area of intellectual monopoly rights, it's WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, which, well, just to introduce you to this organization, which is not exactly well known. It's a specialized United Nations agency, for example, like the UNESCO, which is much better known, which is there for education. WIPO is there for intellectual monopoly rights. A specialized UN agency dealing with treaties on monopolies on ideas. It grew from the offices that administered the Paris and the Berne Convention. Both conventions stem from the end of the 19th century. And concern copyrights and patents, respectively. WIPO sees as its mandate, I quote, to promote the protection of intellectual property throughout the world. If you look at this closely, you will see that it's about protection and intellectual property. They're pushing, the direction of their work is really just to tighten the enforcement of monopoly privileges. They're not about access, at least not until now. They're about restricting access to knowledge as far as possible, about turning knowledge, making knowledge scarce, so that you can put a better price on it. What does WIPO do? What is in its tasks? It drafts and administers treaties on intellectual monopoly rights. The TRIPS treaty would really have been something for WIPO. It did not end up there. It ended up at the World Trade Organization for reasons of internal United Nations politics, especially because the United States thought that WIPO was too much in favor of the developing countries. Well, which might tell you where the WTO stands. WIPO does technical assistance, as they call it. They send people to developing countries to help these countries set up enforcement offices for monopoly rights on ideas. This is a problem, especially in two ways. One, it costs scarce resources. It might be, well, it might be more essential to provide clean water to your population than to set up an office that takes the money from the country and channels it to Time Warner and Sony. Because the money is really needed in the country. It's not needed in the United States, at least not as badly. Or in Europe, for that matter. And well, while they're there, these WIPO officials helping to set up these offices and teaching the people who are going to work there the basics of intellectual monopoly rights, often forget that even the TRIPS treaty has certain flexibilities. They just don't tell these people, you know? They don't mention to them that, for example, the TRIPS treaty gives every nation a right that to, for example, in the case of a national emergency like South Africa experienced, to issue compulsory licenses, meaning to take a patent from a company and say, well, sorry, we can't